First off, I have to say that George Groves and Carl Froch both showed tremendous heart, determination, and physical toughness in that ring on Saturday night. Both of them fought like warriors. Very few of us armchair critics would have the ability or the fortitude to even get through a training camp, let alone get in the ring and produce the type of display that these two men produced on Saturday night. It was a great fight, but unfortunately, it left most observers with a bitter taste in their mouths. And not only because of the referee's decision, but also because of the attitude being displayed by Carl Froch and his trainer, Robert McCracken, in the aftermath of this fight. And this is nothing new. Carl Froch has shown a consistent pattern of arrogance, hypocrisy, and outright delusion throughout the entire course of his career. Now, the purpose of this video is not to try and rubbish Carl Froch. Carl Froch has achieved more in his career than I could ever dream of achieving. This video is a critique of how Carl Froch behaves towards his fellow professional fighters. In the lead up to this fight with George Groves, Froch accused Groves of being disrespectful and downplaying his achievements. But this is a man who's been downplaying the achievements of Joe Calzaghe for the past 5 or 6 years. This is a man who claims that the only UK fighter in history whose resume even comes close to his own is Lennox Lewis. Joe Calzaghe beat a prime Mikhail Kessler far more convincingly than Carl Froch beat an over-the-hill Mikhail Kessler. Joe Calzaghe stepped up to light heavyweight and fought Bernard Hopkins back in 2008, which is something that Carl Froch is not willing to do, despite the fact that Bernard Hopkins called him out last year. And despite the fact that Hopkins is nearly 6 years older now than he was when he fought Joe Calzaghe. Froch ain't willing to do what Calzaghe did, yet he's more than willing to constantly downplay Calzaghe's achievements. But when the shoe is on the other foot and he perceives George Groves as playing down his achievements, then all of a sudden he wants to throw a tantrum. Absolute hypocrisy. And then you look at the way Carl Froch conducted himself after the Andre Dirrell fight. He completely dismissed the views of the majority of neutral fans who felt that Dirrell had actually won. Froch gave Dirrell no credit whatsoever and acted as if the fight wasn't even close in any way and that there was no hometown bias and that he thoroughly deserved a win. But yet, just one fight later, when he lost to Mikhail Kessler, he said that he thought he won the fight by a couple of rounds. He was unhappy with the decision, and that if the fight was in England, he would have won. The hypocrisy is just unbelievable. Then look at how arrogant Carl Froch was in the lead up to the Andre Ward fight. Where was his respect for Ward's achievements? He kept trying to get under Ward's skin throughout the entire build-up, saying Ward is chinny, downplaying his win over Mikhail Kessler and all that. And then the fight takes place. Froch gets absolutely schooled. And in the aftermath, he has the audacity to come out and say it was a very close fight. He actually said that. What planet is this guy on? He even said that Ward was running in the last 2 rounds and that if he had started applying the pressure earlier in the fight, that he could have stopped him. Talk about deluded. And in the weeks following the Ward fight, he was saying stuff like, oh, Ward likes to stay out of harm's way and not get involved. He likes to spoil and hold. He likes to do everything to try and avoid getting hit. He was totally dismissive of the job that Andre Ward did on him. And ever since then, he's been saying things like, well, Wood is not an attraction. If there's going to be a rematch, it has to be in England because I'm the one with the belts. Ward's not in a position to dictate terms. Ward's getting a bit big for his boots. This is the stuff that he's been coming out with. Absolutely unbelievable. In fact, it's only recently, after a lot of public backlash, especially in the United States, that Froch has started to give Andre Ward any credit at all. The arrogance and delusion in Carl Froch's mind is absolutely unbelievable. And then we get to the build-up of last weekend's fight with George Groves. Froch was offended by George Groves' critique of his resume, despite the fact that he himself has done the exact same thing to other fighters. And all George Groves was doing was telling the truth. Groves told him that he was getting schooled by Jermaine Taylor prior to the knockout, which was true. He told him that he got a highly controversial win over Andre Dirrell, which most neutral people thought he didn't deserve, which was true. He told him that he lost to Mikkel Kessler, which was true. He told him that he did a far better job on Glenn Johnson than Carl Froch did, which was true. He told him that he got completely outclassed by Andre Ward, which was true. He told him that he fought an over-the-hill Kessler in the rematch, which was true. He told him that he had a lot of weaknesses and a leaky defense, which was true. So all George Groves did was tell the truth. All right? Carl Froch basically didn't like the tone of George Groves' voice. He didn't like Groves' demeanor. He felt that George Groves should have spoken to him in a more respectful tone because he's a two-time world champion and Groves ain't achieved anything yet, blah, blah, blah. But when Froch was a young contender, way before he'd ever fought at world level, he was speaking to Joe Calzaghe in a contemptuous way. In fact, Johnny Nelson raised this exact point with Carl Froch on ringside. He said to Froch, "Don't you see Groves as a younger version of yourself? Because when you were coming up, you were doing the exact same thing to Joe Calzaghe." And Froch was like, no, not at all, because I was the number one contender for Calzaghe's title, and Groves is only number 5 or 6 in the IBF rankings for my title. So what he's saying is that he had the right to talk shit to the champion because he was number one contender. But George Groves had no right because he was only number 5 or 6 in the rankings. Completely ridiculous, but let's just follow this through. Now, we all know that the governing bodies and their rankings are a complete joke anyway. The only thing that really matters or holds any weight in boxing is who you've fought and who you've beat. And when Carl Froch first started running his mouth on Joe Calzaghe, his 2 best wins at the time were over Brian McGee and an over-the-hill Robin Reed. All right? And George Groves' best wins leading up to the Froch fight was over James DeGale and Glenn Johnson. So you tell me, who's better? Brian McGee or James DeGale? Robin Reed or Glenn Johnson? You tell me. At the very least, we can all agree that those opponents were at least of a similar type of level. So Carl Froch don't have a leg to stand on. This idea that he had the right to run his mouth, but that somehow George Groves doesn't, is completely ridiculous. And then we move on to the aftermath of last weekend's fight. Carl Froch has actually come out and said that the referee saved George Groves' career. This man is so arrogant and deluded, it's unbelievable. The truth is, nobody knows for certain whether or not George Groves could have continued and survived that 9th round. Nobody. Anyone who says otherwise is either completely deluded or flat out lying. But what we do know, all right, what we do know for certain is that unlike Lucian Bute, George Groves was not helpless on the ropes, having his head bounced around. Unlike Lucian Bute, George Groves still had his wits about him. Unlike Lucian Bute, he was actually blocking a lot of the punches with his arms and gloves. Unlike Lucian Bute, he was still throwing punches back. Unlike Lucian Bute, he still had the wherewithal and the strength in his legs to get himself off the ropes right before the referee stepped in. And unlike Lucian Bute, George Groves had proved that he had the power to hurt Carl Froch. He dropped Froch and nearly knocked him out in the first round. Unlike Lucian Bute, he was ahead on all the judges' scorecards. But despite all that, Lucian Bute was actually given far more time to try and ride out the storm, despite the fact that he was far more hurt than George Groves was. You know, Juan Manuel Marquez was in far worse trouble against Manny Pacquiao in the first fight and the fourth fight than George Groves was against Carl Froch. But the referee could see that Marquez still had his wits about him, despite the fact that he'd been dropped and was under heavy fire. And he proved that the referee made the correct decision by allowing him to continue by what he did in the fight after that point. Yeah? George Groves didn't take anywhere near the amount of clean shots that Marquez took when Pacquiao dropped him. He wasn't in anywhere near the amount of trouble that Marquez was in. In fact, George Groves never even hit the canvas. But unlike Marquez, he wasn't given the opportunity to try and ride out the storm. But Carl Froch has come out and said that Groves definitely would have got knocked out and that the referee made the right decision and actually saved George Groves' career by stopping the fight. Is that so, Mr. Froch? You know, before this fight, Carl Froch said that he would destroy George Groves. He made out as though it was an easy night's work. Like all he had to do was turn up and hit Groves on his supposedly glass jaw and the fight would be over. He said the only chance Groves had of even lasting the distance is if he ran around the ring all night. And even in that scenario, Froch said that he would easily beat Groves on points by a wide margin. This guy actually came into the fight believing that he was some type of master boxer. He had a totally unrealistic view of his own ability. You know, but the reality is that George Groves was by far the better boxer. Groves was by far the more skilled. And the only person who was ever in danger of being blown away early was Carl Froch. He was being humiliated and embarrassed in that ring. He was being made to eat his own words. His reputation was being destroyed by a man he claimed he was simply going to walk through. So if the referee saved anyone's career, it was Carl Froch's career. Froch is the one whose blushes were spared. He's the one who was given the get out of jail free card. Carl Froch was shocked by what took place in that ring. And the reason he was shocked is because he thinks he's a hell of a lot better than he actually is. He has a completely unrealistic, overinflated view of himself. You know, and then we get to after the fight, right? The crowd actually booed Carl Froch during the post-fight interview. And this was a pro-Froch crowd going in. They actually booed him in the post-fight interview. And the reason they booed him is because they listened to Froch's comments and finally realized what I've been saying about him for years. They realized that Carl Froch is actually an incredibly arrogant and deluded man and has a complete lack of humility. And unfortunately, it seems like his trainer, Robert McCracken, has a very similar attitude. In a post-fight interview with BBC Radio 5 Live, McCracken said, I'm quoting him word for word, he said, "No one in this arena genuinely believes George Groves could have carried on, which is an outright lie. That is a blatant lie, right? It's blatantly obvious that the main reason the crowd booed the referee's decision is because they did believe George Groves could carry on. They believed George Groves was still in the fight and that he did have a chance of recovering and coming back. That's the main reason the entire Sky team disagreed with the referee's decision, because they also believed that George Groves did have a chance of getting through the crisis and that he was not completely out of it. Yet Robert McCracken is so arrogant and so deluded that he thinks he can speak for the entire audience while simultaneously dismissing their reaction and everyone else's opinion. The fact of the matter is, it was a premature stoppage. And that's why everyone was so upset. In the same interview, they pointed out that Carl Froch was far more badly hurt when he was dropped in the first round than George Groves was in the 9th round. Yeah? Far more badly hurt. But Carl Froch was allowed to continue and George Groves wasn't. And Robert McCracken had absolutely no response to that. He just ignored the point altogether. But it gets even worse. When McCracken was asked whether or not him and Froch would accept a rematch with Groves, he basically implied that there's no reason for a rematch because, in his words, Carl has nothing to prove. He stopped George Groves. He has nothing to prove. This man is so deluded, it's incredible. What planet is this guy on? And another ridiculous thing that McCracken came out with. He said that Carl Froch gave George Groves the opportunity to fight for the title. As if he did George Groves a favor or something. What's he talking about? Carl Froch was forced to fight George Groves by the IBF. George Groves was the mandatory challenger. If he didn't fight Groves, he would have been stripped of his title. And George Groves would have fought for the vacant title against somebody else. So what are you talking about? Froch gave Groves the opportunity. He didn't give him anything. Oh my God. I mean, the attitude of Froch and McCracken, as you can see, is leaving a bitter taste in the mouth of most boxing fans, and it's turning most boxing fans, against them. That's what's happening. Now, as far as a rematch goes, there's actually a hell of a lot of things George Groves could do to improve on his performance in that first fight. There's a hell of a lot of things he could do, because he did make a lot of mistakes in the fight, despite the fact he was dominating, despite the fact that he was winning the fight, despite the fact that he came close to knocking Froch out in the first round. I think tactically he was a little bit rigid. I do think that George Groves fell in love with his power a little bit in the first round. I do think that happened. Yeah. From that point on, he really wanted to knock Carl Froch out. I think that was part of it. But I also think, just judging by the first round before the knockdown, that George Groves clearly came into the fight looking to implement a very similar game plan to Andre Ward. He'd obviously studied the Ward fight and used that as his main blueprint to beat Carl Froch. Because if you look at the fight, right, most people expected Groves to try and move around. He didn't do that. He actually came forward, which is what Andre Ward did. And he was doing a lot of the same things that Ward was doing. He was holding Carl Froch's left arm, in the clinches and trying to hit Carl Froch with left hooks on the inside. He was trying to push Carl Froch back to the ropes. Right? He was trying to hit Carl Froch with left hook counters. Go watch the fight. Because that's one thing I pointed out before the Ward fight, is that Carl Froch was wide open to left hooks. And that obviously played out in the Ward fight. And Groves tried to make it play out again in this fight. Although his left hook was not as consistent or as good as Ward's left hook, but he did try and play that out. Now, like I say, judging by what happened in the first round, even before the knockdown, to me it seemed as though Groves really was trying to implement exactly what Andre Ward did. Yeah? That's what he was trying to do. So I think, tactically, he was trying to go for the Ward thing. But the thing is, you have to be a little bit adaptive during a fight. Groves had to realize that he does hit harder than Andre Ward. He's more explosive than Andre Ward, which is why he was able to drop Froch. But he's not as technically sound or savvy as Andre Ward, and he should have taken that into account. In those exchanges where he was exchanging with Carl Froch, there was a lot of body contact. Carl Froch is a very physically strong man. He's very tough. So, George Groves must have known that he was ahead in the fight, right? He should have taken some rounds off and moved around and said, you know what? Let me make it easy this round. Let me regain my energy and just beat Froch on the back foot, because he could have done that. Because Carl Froch has got terrible balance. He can't follow you around the ring and keep his balance and his defense up at the same time. He can't do it. Yeah, he's going to be following you around the ring with his hands down. He's going to be, swinging wild punches, and he's going to give you plenty of opportunities to counterpunch off the back foot and win the round clearly. And then if you want, after a couple rounds like that, where you win the round like that, you can then go back in and fight him on the inside or do whatever you want to do within reason. All right. So Groves should have chopped it up and changed it up a little bit. Yeah. I think he was a little bit maybe he was sticking to his game plan a bit too much. Who knows? But he should have chopped it up, I think, a little bit, especially given the fact that he must have felt himself that he was starting to get a little winded as the fight went on. Yeah, and he must have known that Carl Froch has got a history of coming on late in fights. He must have known that. So in a rematch, there's a lot of things that George Groves could improve on to make, a rematch go a lot better for himself than the first fight did. And the first fight went pretty well for George Groves up until the controversial ending. Right? So there's a lot of improvements that he can make. But in terms of Carl Froch, I don't really see anything that Carl Froch can do differently, because at 36 years old, you pretty much can't teach this old dog any new tricks. Carl Froch is who he is. He's not going to learn proper balance at 36 years old after a long career. His balance is always going to be terrible. He's not going to learn proper defense. His defense is always going to be terrible, right? His chin, he's got a good chin. He's certainly not infallible. He can be hurt. He can be dropped, as we saw. He can be knocked out. All right. He does have a good chin, but his chin ain't going to get no better after a fight like that. All right. So Carl Froch, I don't see how Carl Froch can improve significantly in any way should a rematch take place. Yeah. I think the rematch is there for George Groves to win rather than, it's there for George Groves to lose rather than for Carl Froch to win. Right? I don't see how Carl Froch can beat George Groves in a rematch unless George Groves, fights foolishly. Yeah? If he just uses a bit more versatility, I don't see why he can't beat Carl Froch absolutely convincingly in the rematch. I don't see any reason why not. All right, he's proved he's tough enough. He's proved he's strong enough. He's got the power to hurt Froch. He's got all the skills to throw off Froch's balance and expose all his weaknesses. He's got more than enough to beat Carl Froch as long as he applies it correctly. Yeah? But whether or not the rematch takes place, who knows? Who knows, man? At this stage, Froch and McCracken don't seem too keen on the rematch. But then again, I'm sure Sky Sports are extremely keen on the rematch, and Eddie Hearn and Sky Sports will probably be, throwing around all kinds of crazy amounts of money in the air, possible, amounts of money in the air at Carl Froch, because the rematch would be huge. They could definitely have it in a stadium. The rematch would be absolutely huge. So, we'll have to wait and find out if the rematch takes place. But other than George Groves, where else is there for Carl Froch to go? He's stuck between a rock and a hard place, really. What's he going to do? All right? Andre Ward already beat him. If he fights Ward, he's going to get beat again. That's what's going to happen. Yeah? And he probably won't make as much... I'm not sure, but he probably won't make as much money fighting Andre Ward as he would as he would get fighting a rematch with Groves. All right? So, Is that really a viable option for Carl Froch to fight Andre Ward? The fight probably won't even be exciting anyway. So who else can he fight out there? What, James DeGale? Does he want to risk losing or looking bad against another up-and-coming brash contender like he did in the Groves fight? Does he want to risk doing that? Who's Carl Froch going to fight? Who's out there for him? You tell me. You tell me who you think is out there for Carl Froch. And if a rematch don't happen, George Groves is going to have a ton of opportunities. Right? A ton of opportunities. A lot of people would have seen the fight. And he's going to have a ton of opportunities, going forward. Andre Ward might be interested in fighting George Groves now. I'm not sure if Stieglitz would be interested, but I'm sure Andre Ward will be looking at it and saying, you know what? That's a sellable fight now. Even in the US. We saw what he did to Froch. It's a sellable fight. So, we'll have to wait and find out what exactly takes place. You know me, obviously I want to see the rematch. Yeah, I want to see the rematch. The first fight was exciting. It came to a very premature conclusion. I want to see the rematch. But let's just see what happens going forward. So drop your comments below. I know there's a lot of a lot of conflicting views on this. A lot of people have attacked my stance on the whole, on the whole fight and my views on Carl Froch, whatever. But I feel like I backed up my argument very well, extremely well. So, yeah, let me know what you feel about this. Drop your comments in the comment section below. Where do you think both fighters go from here? What do you think happens in a rematch? Yeah, let me know. This is Hatman. I'm out.